Mao, and he comes out of the Caribou district, and you can see on one side is an Occidental miner, a white miner, and the other side is probably an Indian or a half-blood miner. And he was perfectly accepted in the gold fields of British Columbia, unlike their acceptance in California. And this particular miner became so well known that Owlbow Creek and Owlbow Lake and various other places were named after him.
It was actually really dangerous for the Chinese in the United States.
Extremely dangerous in the United States. If you cover the records of the Chinese miner, which is most of those records are available in Sacramento, you will find that up to 100 Chinese miners were murdered per year in the gold rush years, and very seldom was anyone brought to justice because of that. So the Chinese were treated extremely badly in California, and I think in the first year in British Columbia, in 1858, until the British Columbia Police came into effect in 1859. And in that year, a number of Chinese deaths occurred, and some of those were probably from foul play. It seems to indicate that from the original photographs and the newspaper reports.
This is a fascinating find, you know.
Yeah,
it looks just like a walking stick, a little, what kind of brass or copper neck here?
Yeah, that actually came off an opium tin at one time.
And you pull it off.
And there's English steel to greet you.
And this would have been what, a piece of Chinese defense?
Very definitely. This was found in one of the old Chinese stores on Front Street in Yale, parked in a corner, and the Chinese would have used this as a walking stick, but if he got into trouble on the trail, serious trouble, he would resort to the blade on the end.
That's a fascinating find.
Yeah, it's one of the few in British Columbia.
Did you know what you had when you saw that, or was this a bit of a surprise?
A bit of a surprise, because Gus left that on, and then he pulled off the top, and of course it was well disguised. And great. Gus enjoyed it. He was a nice man.
That is a real... And they would carry that around as a piece of self-defense?
Sure they would. And they could use it both ways. They could use it in the actual, you know, warding off, and then use the blade if they had to.
Yeah. Well, I can hardly believe that it was just as a result of the BC police that the Chinese found it safer here. Was it just a sort of a safer, more benevolent country?
Well, it was English law.
Yeah.
And so English law really did support all minorities. And much different than California law, which made the Chinese and the Indian more or less fair game for everybody.
They made lots of money, the Chinese, but were they constantly paying back these benevolent associations?
Well, yeah, this is how they did it, Mike. I mean, here are a couple of Chinese miners working in the big canyon on the Fraser, and they worked all these bars and benches all the way up the canyon, Mike. And here they are working with a rocker, and usually it's a two-man operation. And at the end of the day, they would weigh their gold and find out how much they'd made and pay back so much to the Benevolent Association for their fare over. And they would eventually go back to China. Some of these men went back to China as very wealthy men indeed.
This is a remarkable little find. Tell me about this book and what it represents.
That book is very definitely an important find. That came originally out of the Milliken collection, and it is a Chinese provisioner's book, and it may be, if our research indicates it, a goldfield banker's book. Certainly, the Chinese miners were banking with this particular individual. Now, there was a larger ledger which has been lost, and it probably will never be recovered. But it indicates how much the Chinese miners made on each of these bars and how much they brought into this merchant banker. And some of these Chinese miners, Mike, were bringing in 30 ounces at a time. They were mining for Yale Bar and Hills Bar years afterwards. Now, the information in this book runs from 1869 till the 1880s. So this is over 100 years old. Very important document. In fact, the National Museum in Ottawa is rather interested in it. And I'm going to let them have the information on this particular book.
Have you had translations? I mean, have the...
Yes, this was translated by my translator, Winnie Louie, of the University of British Columbia, who does a lot of this translation, because it's written in ancient Cantonese, which is dynasty Chinese, which the average individual cannot read with great accuracy.
Would they bring these kind of scholars along? Did the banker come as the banker, not as somebody who was trying to find his wealth? I mean, these people have an advanced man, they have a banker, and we'll see later on today they had laundry people, bath people.
The Chinese community was insular, so they had bankers, they had you know, restaurants, they had merchants, they had, you know, various other people, so they could stay within the Chinese community without having to go outside the Chinese community. And these Chinese communities were all up the Fraser. They were at Yale, to a lesser extent at Hope, And of course, they were in the Barkerville gold fields. And here it shows the main street of Barkerville. And this is the Chinese section of Barkerville, which was a separate section within Barkerville itself.
And there's the bathhouse there and all sorts of other things.
The bathhouse and the restaurant and so on.
Not associated with the Chinese is the little kid who's standing to get his picture taken.
Yes.
Wouldn't you love to know everything about everybody in these photographs?
Yes. Unfortunately, he is not identified, which is kind of too bad.
This is, what is this?
Well, that's a medicine stick, and it's written in black. So the medicine that would be in front of the little bottles in front of the Chinese drugstore. So you know if you took the medicine from there, if you took too much, it would not kill you. However, if those Chinese characters were in red, that would mean that it would be very dangerous and you could not take too much and they might be fatal. And I didn't procure one of the red medicine sticks. Why, I don't know, Mike.
Is those the kind of things that make you
Yes, sure I should have. Sure I should have.
Well, where would you find a thing like this?
That came out of a Chinese medicine store in Victoria many years ago.
And again, something to be translated to find out what this non-cobra venom was good for.
Yes, certainly.
Okay. So they were involved in Barkerville and assimilated. Here we even see, I guess this must be some sort of a Saturday night hoot.
Well, this is kind of interesting because it shows that the fraternity between the white miners and the Chinese. There are 3 Chinese seated at the table here, and 1 miner whom is identified as a Cornish miner, and there are a lot of Cornish miners in the Caribou, and they are drinking Chinese wine and Chinese repast. You can tell by the various utensils and various things on the table.
Now, who would take that photo? Because, I mean, that's remarkable. It's an indoor photo, a long, obviously, exposure.
Yes, probably 1890s, I'm judging from it. There's no indication on the photograph itself, and this is from the archives of British Columbia, but it's probably 1890s.
Pot like this may be part of a party as well?
Yes, this would be part and parcel of the party, and you find these still in the old Chinese diggings, some of them, most of them smashed, of course, some of them intact, and they're becoming rarer and rarer, and people who do find these should actually indicate where they came from, because otherwise they lose some of their historic value. And
so this would be, you drink something out of that, either through there to let the air in there, or from there?
Yeah, and there'd be cork in that too, of course.
Good thinking, okay. The rituals were all maintained. And the next shot is a funeral that was actually taking place in Barkerville.
Yes, this is most interesting. The Chinese funerals, where the whites tend to wear black, the Chinese wear white. And it was a very solemn procession. And, of course, they are taking the body to be interred. Now, the interesting thing about this, Mike, is that after the Chinese funeral, the body was interred, buried somewhere locally, usually in a Chinese burial plot, which was fairly close to the white burial plot. And after some years, the Chinese gravedigger in that area would be sent back to disinter the body and to send the bones back to China, because this is why if you go anywhere in British Columbia, into Granite Creek or into the Caribou Gold Fields or into the Amanika or into the East Kootenai and so on, you will find that the old Chinese burials are all excavated. And what happened, of course, they were allowed the undertaker was allowed to actually disinter them, and anything that was found with them, for instance, Bill Hong, who wrote a book in the Caribou, an old Chinese miner, mentioned that one of these bodies was found in Quesnel Forks, and the deceased was wearing kind of a quilted jacket, and the family had to mention that anything of value was to be returned to them, but this family did not, and each one of these little squares of the quilted jacket contained a gold coin. And so this was a bonus for the funeral director, so to speak.
Would anybody have known about that? I mean, that jacket, or was this old man's banking method?
This is his walking bank, and it was always on him. He probably went to sleep at night with this quilted jacket on. Quesnel Forks is rather cool even at night in the summer. So he was was always there. Nobody knew anything about it. That was his pension for eventually when he went back to China. Unfortunately, he did not make it.
These undertakers occasionally fell into quite some treasures.
Oh, sure they did. Sure they did. We don't know much about it because the Chinese tend to be close-mouthed about it.
What a story.
Yeah.
A quilted jacket with a gold coin in every one. This is not from the Caribou.
No, this shows the extent of the Chinese mining operations all through the province. And, this particular shot is taken on the Wild Horse. And this was a huge hydraulic operation. In other words, they took a hydraulic or what's sometimes called a monitor or a giant.
A gun that just blasts
yeah,
the water
a gun that
into
blasts off and it comes down over a bedrock sluice, and you can see a sluice box way up there, up to the center left of the photograph. And they worked these hills back, hundreds and hundreds of feet, and we don't know how much they actually got out of the Wild Horse. The figures range from several $1 million, Mike, right up to about $20-odd million, and some were probably, the true figure is probably somewhere in between, but very, very rich diggings. Largest nugget was about 3 pounds.
See, I don't, when I think of the Chinese miner, I don't think of him mining that way. I think of him sniping and carefully examining, but they did get into real high grading.
Oh, sure they did. There was usually a Chinese prospector, a Chinese headman, a Chinese monitor man, a water man, a cleanup man, everybody who was good at a certain job. And that's why they were such efficient miners. When they went over the ground, it was like a vacuum cleaner going over the ground in most instances.
Were there quarrels between these people, between Chinese groups that were mining an area? It seems there were a lot of that amongst white miners. They would have falling out with their partners?
Nothing like the Weaverville War, which took place in California, when there were some number of casualties, actually deaths between two particular tongs, one from Hong Kong and one from Canton. And this did not, as far as we know, occur in British Columbia. There was some rivalry between the tongs, but no wars as such.
We're still with Wild Horse in the Kootenays, and the next shot is of some of the accommodation in the place.
Yes, this is the second town. This is called Kootenay. The first town was called Fisherville. And this is taken by Ernest Brown in probably 1882 or possibly 1881. And it shows a typical mining camp, and there's a Chinese miner talking to an Indian woman, and there's a horse in the background. And these cabins stood, actually, Mike, until about the early 1950s.
Would there any of the wreckage still be around?
Well, actually, we screened in the town and did fairly well. Cyril Murray and I, an old friend and I.
This looks like a more official location, the picket fence, and quite a gathering of people, yes. Chinese and whites
That's
together
right.
again.
There's a mixture there, and on the extreme right-hand side is Chinese miner looking out and celebrating along with the white miners. Possibly they've discovered something, and it looks like a bit of a celebration. There's some bottles being brandished there, and this is near the post office in old Kootenay, or Wild Horse.
A lot of effort put into that stone wall. I guess that was just sort of gleaning the ground, getting it out of the way.
Stone wall, parts of it are still there.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Who is this fine character?
That is Lum Kim. And Lum Kim was an interesting, one of the old-time miners who worked on the Wild Horse and eventually settled down to market gardening down near Fort Steele, between Wild Horse and Fort Steele. Very noble-looking man.
Any particular reason why he is identified and recognized today?
Well, he was a very famous man in that particular area. I used to correspond with his wife, and interesting guy.
Lum Kim.
Lum Kim. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And there's our final shot from the historic area is of what's this building? Is this an indication of the wealth of the place?
Well, to a degree. If you wander through that Wild Horse country, Mike, and we eventually will wander through it and touch it more closely, there are still a lot of remains in that particular country. You can see the remains of old Chinese cabins, and this is one of the larger cabins, which housed, as near as we can tell, somewhere around 24 Chinese who were working all those crevices and cracks in the Wild Horse and on Boulder Creek and all those fascinating area under the shadow of Fisher Peak. It's really quite an intriguing area. I find the Wild Horse one of the most interesting areas in British Columbia.
Well, I guess this is the question for after the break. Why didn't they ever get to Atlin? And we've got lots of artifacts, and maybe we can do that after the break.
Sure,
okay?
We'll touch on that, Mike.
We'll be back to discuss further the Chinese in British Columbia when we return from these commercials. Those towns, Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee. Why didn't they get to Atlin?
Well, Mike, one major reason. Atlin was discovered in 1898. It was discovered before that, but technically 1898, and so was the Yukon, although it was 1896 too. And predominantly American miners, they didn't want Chinese miners in there. They knew that the Chinese miners would end up with most of the gold, so simply they were not allowed into the Atlin or the Yukon areas.
Sort of a bad place for the Chinese to be.
Yeah.
So they just plain didn't go.
They avoided it.
This little cylinder contains a little fascinating story. What is the cylinder, first of all?
Well, the cylinder actually is an opium tin. There are several types of opium tins. Usually they were square. This particular one was round. And I put in a couple of items that were picked up in the Chinese gold fields. And one I found and one I didn't. The silver one is what we call silver boat money. And it comes in various sizes, and there's a little chop mark in the center, which is kind of a hallmark to show it's original. And the second piece is quite interesting. That's a 24-karat gold pin. And there's an interesting story behind it. I was out with an old friend of mine some years ago, a guy called Doug Dodd, about 10 years ago, and he mentioned that he had found the remains of an old Chinese store on the banks of the Fraser River. And he said he'd recovered everything from this because he'd gone through the ground very, very carefully, which is essentially sand. And I said, did you take a screen to it? And he said, no, I didn't. So we went down there and started screening this particular area. And what had happened is this store had been on the bank above the river's edge. And somebody had actually pushed the store over the bank, and the store fell over the bank onto the edge of the river. And the high water washed away the rest of the store, Mike, but left some remnants of the store. And in the store somewhere was a small strong box. And it was obviously a wooden box because we found the hinges, but not the wood itself. We also found the key to the box. Mm-hmm. And so everything was washed away except some of the gold and silver items, which were quite a lot heavier, and some of the other items such as cylinders and lead musket balls and so on. So this Chinese merchant who had owned this store had a small box that he had kept all his valuables in, or things that he wanted. And some of these things were American coins and Canadian coins, early stuff, 1880s and so on. And this gold pin, a gold ring, several silver pieces of jewelry, a band actually of jewelry made, which was out of silver as well. And we did very, very well in an area of about 10 feet by 15 feet. And that was where this treasure had spread out. And the surprising thing, Mike, was this, is that at least several thousand fishermen had walked right over that site. But they were looking at other things. They were looking at the river itself rather than the ground, whereas Doug and I, we focused on the ground itself.
And why do they call it boat silver?
Well, because the actual silver itself is shaped like an original Chinese junk. So and they came in various sizes.